The End of USD, When the World Stopped Trusting America's Money. Introduction. The $190 billion Whisper. Imagine all the money in the world. What if one country's money was the most important? Not just inside its own borders, but everywhere, for everyone. For the last 80 years, that's been the reality. The United States dollar has been the world's money. Think of it like a giant global cafeteria. To buy anything, oil from Saudi Arabia, electronics from China, coffee from Brazil, you first needed a pocketful of US dollars. It was the only currency the sellers would universally accept. This position gave America enormous power. Then, a strange whisper started in 2025. Countries began to borrow and lend to each other on a massive scale without using the dollar. In just a few months, these non-dollar deals blew past $190 billion. On the surface, it just looked like business as usual. But it wasn't. It was the sound of countries quietly building new doors in the cafeteria, doors that didn't require dollars to walk through. This book tells the story of that quiet rebellion. It answers one central question. Is the dollar losing its spot as the world's #1 currency? And what does that mean for the rest of us? That $190 billion figure wasn't just a number. It was a signal, a vote of no confidence in a system that had run the world for nearly a century. This is the story of why it's happening, how it started, and what a world no longer ruled by the dollar might look like. Chapter 1. How the dollar became king. No currency becomes king by accident. The dollar's story begins in the wreckage of World War II. The year is 1944. Most of the world is in ruins, their economies shattered. But America is different. The war wasn't fought on its soil. Its factories are booming, and most importantly, it holds over 2/3 of the entire world's gold supply locked away in its vaults. Leaders from all the Allied nations met that year in a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They needed to create a stable system so the world could rebuild. The solution they agreed on was simple. Instead of every currency being a gamble, they would all be tied to the US dollar. And the US dollar, in turn, was tied to gold at a fixed price of $35 an ounce. The dollar was now the world's anchor. It was trustworthy because it was backed by actual, physical gold. This system, known as Bretton Woods, worked for a while. It provided the stability the world desperately needed. But by the 1970s, America was spending huge amounts of money, partly on the Vietnam War. Other countries started to get nervous. They suspected America was printing more paper dollars than it had gold to back them up. So they started asking for their gold back, trading in their dollars as promised. They were right to be worried. On a Sunday night in 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and made a shocking announcement. He declared that the U.S. would no longer exchange dollars for gold. He had unilaterally broken the promise that the entire global financial system was built on. This should have been a catastrophe for the dollar. It was now backed by nothing but a promise from the U.S. government. But then, America pulled off a political masterstroke. The administration made a deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's biggest oil producer. The deal was this. Saudi Arabia, and all the other major oil-producing nations in OPEC, would agree to sell their oil only in US dollars. Think about what that meant. Every country in the world needs oil. To buy oil, they now had to get their hands on US dollars first. This created a massive, artificial, and permanent demand for American currency. The dollar was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by oil. This was the birth of the petrodollar system. It cemented the dollar as the king of all currencies and gave America a power that economists call exorbitant privilege. America could print money to buy things from other countries, and the rest of the world had no choice but to accept it. It was like having a magic credit card with no limit and no bill ever coming due. But when you hold that much power, it's tempting to use it. And as the world entered the 21st century, America began to use the dollar not just as a tool for trade, but as a weapon. Chapter 2. Using the dollar as a weapon. Imagine the owner of that global cafeteria we talked about, the one where everyone has to use his special tokens, suddenly decides he doesn't like you. So, he flips a switch, and your token card stops working. You can't buy lunch. Then he goes further, telling all the other food stands that if they serve you, their token machines will be shut off, too. You are now a financial outcast. This is what America learned it could do by controlling the world's money. Because most international trade was priced in dollars, and most large dollar payments had to pass through banks in the U.S., the American government realized it could freeze individuals, companies, or even entire countries out of the global financial system. This practice is known as weaponizing the dollar. For a long time, these powerful tools, called sanctions, were used only against small, isolated nations. But over the last 2 decades, their use has exploded. Sanctions became the go-to foreign policy tool for the United States. They were used against rivals like Iran and North Korea, but also against major global powers like Russia and large Chinese technology companies. The ultimate wake-up call for the rest of the world came in 2022. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies did something unprecedented. They froze Russia's central bank reserves. These were hundreds of billions of dollars that Russia, like every other country, held in foreign currencies, mostly dollars and euros, as its national savings. The message sent by this act was terrifying to every finance minister on the planet, whether they were friends of America or not. It said that the money you save in dollars, the money you thought was the safest asset in the world, is not truly yours. It can be taken away from you with the flip of a switch in Washington, D.C. Suddenly, holding massive amounts of US dollars no longer looked like a safe financial strategy. It looked like a dangerous political vulnerability. What if you had a disagreement with the US over trade? Or foreign policy? Could your country be next? This fear is the single biggest reason the de-dollarization movement gained speed. It was no longer a theoretical idea debated by academics. It became a practical and urgent matter of national security. Countries realized they needed an escape route, a way to trade and save that didn't depend on the goodwill of the United States. And a powerful group of nations was already busy building one. Chapter 3. The rebellion begins. The rebellion against the dollar isn't being led by a single country. It's being driven by a group of nations known as BRICS. The name stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Together, they represent over 40% of the world's population and a huge chunk of the global economy. For years, many in the West dismissed BRICS as just a political club with no real teeth. But they shared one powerful, unifying goal: to build a world where they were less dependent on the United States and its dollar. They started building the pillars of a whole new financial system, operating in parallel to the American-led one. First, they created their own banks. The most important one is the New Development Bank. Think of it as their version of the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Its purpose is to give out loans for big projects, like building roads and power plants. Crucially, it's starting to lend money in the members' own currencies, not in dollars. This means a country can borrow for a project without having to worry about the value of the dollar changing. Second, and this is the most important part, they began building their own financial plumbing. When banks send millions of dollars across borders, they use a special messaging system called SWIFT to make sure the money gets to the right place. SWIFT is based in Belgium, but the US has significant influence over it and has used that influence to cut countries off from the network. So, China built an alternative, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS. Russia and India have their own smaller systems, too. Imagine SWIFT is the world's main email provider, like Gmail. CIPS is like a new, secure email service built by a rival company. It allows countries to communicate and trade directly with each other, in their own currencies like the Chinese yuan, completely bypassing the dollar-based system. Their emails never have to pass through American servers. This movement isn't about destroying the dollar overnight. It's about making it optional. China is now settling most of its trade with Russia in their own currencies. India is buying oil from the Middle East using its own rupee. Brazil and China have a deal to do the same. Each of these deals is another brick in the wall of a non-dollar world. For a business in Brazil, if it's faster, cheaper, and safer to trade with China using yuan, why would they continue to use the dollar? But this new system, this grand escape plan, is being built on a very shaky foundation: debt. And the way countries are using that debt is creating a whole new kind of danger. Chapter 4. A dangerous escape. Let's go back to that $190 billion surge in non-dollar loans. While Western bankers saw it as a sign of confidence, the reality was often one of desperation. It was a massive, risky escape plan. Here's the trap many developing countries were in. For years, they had borrowed money in US dollars because interest rates were low. But when the US raised its own interest rates to fight inflation at home, the dollar became much stronger. For a country like Kenya or Pakistan, This was a nightmare. Their national income was in their own weak currency, but their debt was in the strong dollar. Suddenly, they had to pay back far more than they had borrowed, just because of the change in currency value. It's like having your salary paid in pesos while your mortgage is due in dollars. If the dollar gets stronger, your mortgage payment eats up more and more of your salary, even though the payment itself hasn't changed. So, these countries were scrambling. The surge in borrowing in other currencies, like the yuan or the euro, was their way of trying to get out of this trap. They were essentially taking out new credit cards in different currencies to pay off their old, expensive dollar-denominated credit card. But this escape plan is incredibly risky. The old system, for all its flaws, had a backstop. When a country was about to go bankrupt, the US-dominated International Monetary Fund, or IMF, would step in. It would provide a bailout loan and force the country to fix its economy. It was often painful, but it prevented a total meltdown. Who is the backstop in the new system? If a country defaults on a huge loan from China or a group of international investors, who manages the crisis? There is no clear leader or established set of rules. It's like jumping off a ship that you think is sinking, but you're not sure if the lifeboat you're aiming for even has a motor. We saw a preview of this in Sri Lanka in 2022. The country had taken on massive debts, including from China, to build flashy projects that didn't make much money. When a crisis hit and their dollars ran out, the country collapsed into chaos. There was no simple, organized rescue plan. Now imagine a scenario where a dozen countries get into similar trouble at the same time. This is the danger lurking behind the de-dollarization trend. The global rebellion against the dollar might be accidentally setting the stage for the next great financial crisis, one without a clear firefighter to put out the flames. And the smoke from that fire will eventually drift back to the one country that thought it was fireproof. Chapter 5. What this means for America. For generations, Americans have enjoyed a hidden benefit from the dollar being the world's king. Because everyone needed dollars, the dollar's value was kept artificially high. This meant that goods from other countries, electronics, clothes, cars, food, were cheaper for Americans than they should have been. At the same time, because the world saw U.S. government IOUs, known as Treasury bonds, as the safest place to park their money, the U.S. government could borrow almost unlimited amounts at very low interest rates. This funded everything from the military to tax cuts to social programs. It was the magic credit card in action. So, what happens when the world slowly stops needing and trusting the dollar as much? That magic credit card starts to expire. The consequences for the average American are direct and painful. First, things get more expensive. As the dollar's value drifts down to a more natural level, the price of everything imported goes up. The phone in your pocket, the coffee you drink, the car you drive, if it or its parts were made elsewhere, it will cost more. This isn't a temporary spike, it's a permanent adjustment in the American standard of living. It would feel like a constant, low-grade inflation that you can't get rid of. Second, borrowing gets more expensive for everyone. The U.S. government will have to offer higher interest rates on its IOUs to convince people to still buy them. This is like a person with a bad credit score having to pay a much higher interest rate on their loans. When the government has to spend billions more just on interest payments, that's money it can't spend on healthcare, education, or repairing roads. This fiscal squeeze would also push up interest rates for regular people on things like mortgages and car loans. Finally, America's power in the world shrinks. The ability to place sanctions, to fund a global network of allies, and to influence international events is deeply tied to the power of the dollar. When your currency is just one of many, your voice becomes quieter. For the United States, this isn't some distant, abstract problem. It's a slow-motion unraveling of the economic advantages that have defined the country for the better part of a century. It's the bill for the world's longest free lunch finally arriving at the table. Conclusion: a world with more than one king. The end of the dollar's reign won't be a dramatic Hollywood-style collapse. It will look more like a slow fade. It will look like a business in Brazil paying for supplies from India in a digital currency that is neither the dollar nor the rupee. It will happen in millions of transactions like that, every single day, until one day the world wakes up and realizes it has been rewired. The dollar isn't going to disappear, but its time as the one and only global king is coming to an end. The world is moving from a system with one dominant currency to a multi-currency system, much like the world has several dominant languages instead of just one. The dollar might remain the most important of these, like English, but it will no longer be the only language of global business. This shift was not caused by a single enemy, but by America's own actions and the natural rise of other powers. By using the dollar as a weapon, America gave the world a powerful incentive to find an alternative. And by growing their own massive economies, countries like China and India made an alternative possible. For America, this is a moment of reckoning. It means the end of the exorbitant privilege, the end of the magic credit card. The country will have to live within its means in a way it hasn't had to for generations. It can react to this change with anger and denial, trying to force the world back into a system that is already crumbling. Or, it can see this as an opportunity. An opportunity to focus on the things that made it a great economic power in the first place: innovation, productivity, and the ingenuity of its people. An opportunity to lead by example, not by force. The world has begun to hedge its bets against America's money. The choice now is whether America can once again become a country that the world chooses to bet on.